Hello there. So I probably put something kind of clickbaity in the title or the thumbnail. What I want to talk about today is this sort of idea I had that maybe terms like human sacrifice are not very anthropologically useful. I'm not going to make the argument that it didn't happen. I'm not like a Mesoamerican expert or anything, but as far as I know, the Aztecs absolutely were up there cutting out human hearts and throwing them down the temple steps or whatever. And I've also got no doubt that some people at some point in history were chopped up to make an offering to the gods or whatever. My argument here is instead that the term human sacrifice has been used unfairly. It's been maybe applied unjustly as a sort of another tool for demonizing indigenous people, or maybe even just sort of simplifying things. It's sort of a reductionist term, I think. So I want to sort of give a couple of counterexamples of what I'm talking about. Were the witch burnings a form of human sacrifice? Now, a lot of people hearing that question, they'll go, no, that's not true. They're clearly not a form of human sacrifice. And I want to ask, why not? I also want to sort of ask the question, if European history was written by an alien who hated Europeans, would that alien who hated Europeans have classified stuff like the witch burnings as a form of human sacrifice? When we think about sort of witch burnings, what are they fundamentally? They're a public execution in an attempt to appease the gods. They're a public, extremely brutal execution for religious purposes. We could similarly classify like the burning of heretics and Jews as human sacrifice in this sort of perspective. Now, what are the Aztecs doing up there, cutting out hearts and throwing them down the temple steps? That's a extremely brutal public execution with religious overtones. It's, from a material side, the same thing as the witch burnings. Now, the sort of standard thing that people say is the Aztecs believe that they're offering the blood of the victims to keep the god alive, or whatever the heck people say about the Aztecs. I don't know if that stuff is true or not. I don't know if we've got like the Aztec perspective on Aztec mythology or whatever. I don't know. I'm not very knowledgeable about that area. Are we sure that if the Aztec sacrifice victims were instead being sacrificed because they had supported the wrong god? The people of Tenochtitlan, they are the people chosen by God, God's chosen people, and thereby opposing them is opposing God's will. Therefore, you must all have your hearts cut out and thrown down the temple steps. If that was their rationale, would we still call it human sacrifice? I think we probably would, in which case we should probably call the witch burnings human sacrifice. Because again, it's the same bloody thing. It's a public execution for a pseudo-crime, a religious pseudo-crime. I don't know that I made that point very coherently. We'll see how it looks in editing. The more cuts in this, the less coherent I was at the time of recording. That's a thing of what. So there's a couple of other points I want to make with this sort of line of inquiry. One of them is that human sacrifice is sort of a reductionist term. Why were the Aztecs out there cutting out people's hearts and throwing them down the temple steps? Well, it was a religious thing. Or to put it another way, these people were barbarians who believed a load of garbage. People don't tend to talk about stuff like the witch burnings or the Spanish Inquisition in those terms, unless they're like laymen being sort of pithy like me. Oh, they were out there burning witches because medieval Europeans were a bunch of barbarians who believed a load of garbage. People will generally try to answer that question with something more materialistic. Like, there's the feminist thing. The witch burnings were a sort of state terror campaign to keep women in their place. Or the stuff in Salem or whatever. It was a bunch of like petty feuding within this community, or it was an attempt to like steal property from people who weren't liked very much or whatever. Or it was an attempt to sponsor sort of state legitimacy by enforcing religious conformity, and so on, so on, so on, so on, so on. And you don't generally see those sorts of interpretations applied to stuff like the Aztecs. So like maybe Aztecs up there, they defeat a neighboring power and they take a bunch of prisoners back and they cut out all their hearts throw them down the temple steps. Maybe that had a fundamentally sort of materialistic nature. Like everybody around here, all these neighboring city-states, see what we're doing here? This is going to happen to you if you dare to challenge the might of Tenochtitlan, whatever. Was it really to appease the gods? Or was it a state terror campaign designed to invoke fear in their rivals? And so on, so on, so on, so on, so on. This goes back to that other thing I was talking about the other time with like, it has religious purposes. So I made the sort of argument that it elevates things that maybe don't need elevation. So like that's clearly just a stupid doll. Like saying it had religious significance puts way too much importance on it or whatever. This other person made the argument that the opposite's true as well. You could take a telephone and say that it has religious importance or ritual significance because talking on the telephone, that is a part of our culture. Saying that it has this thing, it had religious significance, that is a way of obscuring its actual purpose. It's a way of not talking about its actual purpose. And you can do the same thing about a lot of elements of culture. Why do men in Western society wear a belt? Yeah, it's part of fashion. Yeah, it's part of our sort of shared sort of cultural identity, our sort of image of what a properly dressed man is he's got a belt on. But the real answer is people wear a belt to keep their pants up. And to sort of talk about things in terms of religious significance is to sort of ignore the materialist side of things. And this sort of thing, I think, it's used for sort of nefarious purposes, for like colonial purposes. The Aztecs, they're out there cutting out hearts and throwing them down the temple steps. Not for the same sort of normal reasons why we're out here burning witches and Jews and heretics. They're out there eating babies in caves because they're barbarians, and we don't need to understand their practices because they're barbarians, and so on, so on, so on. It's a sort of way of demonizing the other, sort of otherizing the other. I wouldn't mind if it started raining. Anyway, where the heck was I? So I want to give a sort of example of this. So the Romans, again, I'm not very knowledgeable about the Romans, but I read a bit of stuff on them, and I'm more knowledgeable than just your average Joe off the street who doesn't know squat. I know slightly more than squat about the Romans. And they seem to me sort of very proud that they don't do human sacrifice. They're very sort of self-righteous about this, and they use it as justification against other people. So like those druids are out there sacrificing babies in caves. Those druids are out there, whenever they defeat an enemy in war, they take all of the men and they put them up inside of a giant wicker man, and then they burn them alive as an offering to the sun god, or whatever the heck the Romans were saying about the druids or whatever. And so the Romans are saying stuff like, well, we gotta put a stop to this. This is barbarous. It's not right. We gotta annihilate those druids for their own good, because they're just out there destroying themselves. It can't stand all this sort of propagandistic talk that would carry through the ages, and so on, so on, so on. Meanwhile, the Romans are doing something that's not too dissimilar. The Roman practice, you defeat a foreign power, and then you have a bunch of all the prisoners of war that you could get, all the foreign combatants, the enemy soldiers or whatever. You lug them back home, and you make them fight to death in the arena. You make gladiators out of them, and you have them fight each other to death in the arena, or you have them like fed to lions in the arena. Or if you're just feeling vindictive, you just have them crucified along the highway or whatever. The Romans weren't describing this as human sacrifice. They describe it as sort of religious punishment. They back the losing cause, therefore the gods don't favor them, therefore they have displeased the gods, therefore they must die for this. And crucifixion, that's an offering to the sun god, because they're being they're being strung up to be consumed by the sun, or whatever. People being fed to the lion in the arena. The lion's the king of the beasts and the envoy of the sun, or whatever. It's got this mane which emulates the sun's sort of rays and halo. So again, people being fed to the sun gods there in the arena, and so on, so on, so on. I don't know how much of that stuff is a reach. I don't know. I only know one step above squat about Roman religion and stuff like that. So I'm deliberately reaching. But again, this is how sort of an alien who hates Romans might sort of view it, maybe. I don't know. So the Romans, they definitely did not describe what they were doing as human sacrifice, because they hate those people who are out there doing human sacrifice. But I think I would describe what they were doing as human sacrifice. How is crucifying 30,000 people along a highway and leaving them to be consumed by the sun fundamentally different from cutting out the hearts of 30,000 people and throwing them down the temple steps in order to feed the sun god, and so on, so on, so on? I don't really have a sort of point. I just think this is an interesting way to think about things and stuff. So there's one sort of angle I want to additionally pursue. In places like Ireland or wherever, you've got the bog bodies that they find. What's his name? Tolland Man? All that stuff that's very famous and very sort of creepy, and I don't think the photos should be on the internet. It's just, again, it's really weird to me the way that Europeans treat their dead ancestors. Because like you'd never have, no indigenous person in Canada would dig up a bog body and think, holy heck, let's put this in a museum and send its photos all over the internet. It's just weird the way Europeans seem to be completely detached from their history and their ancestors, their people. They don't think of that and think, oh my God, that could be my cousin. I got to get him in a proper burial. That could be my distant great grandfather. I got to get him in the ground, give him a proper burial and a headstone and stuff like that. No, they don't think that. They just think, oh, this is cool. Let's get it in a museum. We can charge tickets for this or whatever. I'm being cynical and probably not very polite there, but like it's just weird. Where the heck was I? Bog bodies. So I think Tolland Man, the sort of interpretation that I often hear of him and other bog bodies is that they were chiefs and princes who were sacrificed to the bog for like a bad harvest or something. In a lot of religious societies, there's this equation of religious leadership with political leadership. So like England, head of England is also the head of the Church of England, and so on, so on, so on. Head of the Vatican City is the head of the Catholic Church. Back in the day, Holy Roman Emperor, that's a religious position and a political position. Egypt, you got the pharaoh, who is a king, as well as the chief priest. Rome, emperor is also the head of the Roman religion. Japan, emperor of Japan is also the son of the sun god, so on, so on, so on. And so the chief of the village, he's expected not just to lead his people wisely and well, he's also expected to keep the gods happy, and so on, so on, so on. There's a drought and the crops are failing, and there's a bit of a famine and people are getting scared, they're in trouble. We really need this crop not to fail. Let's sacrifice the chief to the bog. Now there's two ways you can look at that. One, this is a high value person and therefore it's a high value sacrifice, so therefore this might make the gods happy or whatever. You could also look at that using exactly the same evidence and say that this is a religious execution, because we're having bad harvests. It's the chief's job to keep the gods happy. Therefore, he hasn't been keeping the gods happy. Therefore, he must have done something pretty awful to make the gods this mad at us. So we've got to just execute him, because he's a sinner. He's sinned big time. The facts of both of these two situations would look exactly the same. The difference is in the psychology of people who died 2,000 years ago and didn't write anything down. So one of them, I think most people would term human sacrifice. The other one, according to our witch burning thing, public execution with religious overtones, that's not technically human sacrifice. The witches weren't technically human sacrifice. That Frenchman being hanged, drawn, and quartered for high treason, that's not human sacrifice. That's a public execution for a religious pseudo-crime. Okay, hang, drawn, and quartered, that's another thing worth talking about there. So hang, drawn, and quartered, that was the punishment for high treason. Now what's high treason, really? Why is it different from just regular treason? High treason is a religious crime. It's not just a betrayal of state, it's a betrayal of the head of state and therefore the will of God. The king is God's chosen representative among our people. Therefore, rebellion against the king is rebellion against God's will. And this warrants the highest punishment that Renaissance France had to offer. So he's got to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. They did that in England as well. England, they used the metaphor of the King of England is like the sun. A lot of the treaties over here, there was a treaty with the Ojibwe where they agreed that the King of England shall be like the rising sun to them, and it will provide warmth and sustenance and everything that they need for as long as the sun shall shine. And that's why the redcoats wear red, and that's why the Mounties wear red these days. They're the king's representative on earth. The king is the chosen representative of God. The king is like the sun unto the people. So being hanged, drawn, and quartered, this is a sacrifice to appease the sun god, and so on, so on, so on. So like, I don't think I really have a point, but like my point is this, that if I have a point, my point is this, that I don't see a heck of a lot of difference between a religious execution and a human sacrifice. I think that anything that's sort of called human sacrifice, I think some of it could be legitimately called human sacrifice, but I think anything that's called human sacrifice should be viewed with skepticism, because it just might be more that colonial rhetoric that we've all accepted so deeply that we don't even consider anymore. I hope this was semi-coherent, and that's kind of all I have to say for today. Holy heck, this is getting close to half an hour. My throat's getting tired. That's all I have to say. Ta-ta.